You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to WCAT TV and Radio. I'm Kiki Latimer, and I'm your host for the Catholic Bookworm. And we have with us today Dr. James Starke, who's written a wonderful article entitled Teaching Liturgy in the Seminary. Good morning, Dr. Starke.
Good morning, Kiki.
So how about you start us off with a prayer?
Wonderful. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Direct, we pray, O Lord, all our actions by your holy inspiration, and carry them on by your gracious assistance, so that our every prayer and work may begin in you, and through you be happily completed. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. So let's see, to start off with, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're teaching?
Sure. So I am at St. Mary's Seminary and University in Baltimore, Maryland, and I am the Director of Liturgy and Assistant Professor of Systematic and Liturgical Theology. I've been with St. Mary's for, this is my third year, so I've been here since 2021. Before that, I worked for 3 years as a diocesan director of worship for the Diocese of Arlington in Virginia. And before that, I was working on my doctoral work. So that's my background.
Okay. So having taught in a seminary myself, it's an exciting place to be teaching. And you're teaching, and you're teaching liturgy. So what does that mean?
Teaching liturgy has a lot of different aspects to it. So I like to speak about liturgy in terms of its 5 aspects: the theological, historical, juridical, spiritual, and pastoral aspects of liturgy. And so when we teach liturgy in the seminary, we're looking at all of those different aspects. So we have courses that might focus on the theological and historical, and then we might also have more practical courses focused on the juridical and the pastoral. So we have lots of different opportunities for the men to learn these 5 different aspects of the liturgy.
Now, your article, I just want to mention everyone, your article is in Seminary Journal. It's the spring 2023 edition. And one of the things your article was the second one that I've read. And I noticed it really both of them focus on this coordination of formation within the seminary and how important that is. And I think that's relatively new. This idea of this, I've heard it termed affective maturity, the formation of seminarians on, all aspects of their life. And now the idea that the curriculum needs to really help that formation in the sense that it's a coordinated effect between professors.
Yes, so in the study of liturgy, we really have 2 different types of coordination or collaboration. The first is with other professors teaching in other courses. The documents from the U.S. bishops and from the Vatican make clear that liturgy is really integrated with all of the other theological disciplines. And so coordinating with other professors who teach in Christology, recognizing that in liturgy, it is the Lord Jesus Christ who is present and who is our mediator before the Father, coordinating with professors in Trinitarian theology, since liturgy is, again, worship to the Father through the Son and the Spirit, and many other examples could be given. So liturgy really does integrate both theologically and as a source for other theological classes. And of course, we also rely on disciplines like church history. When we're reviewing the history of liturgy, of course, that's contextualized within a broader ecclesiastical history. So that's one dimension. The other dimension of collaboration is with, as you mentioned, there's wider areas of formation, not just intellectual. There's human, spiritual, and pastoral. So being able to engage with the men in the chapel, in their parish liturgical ministries, in their preparations to celebrate these rites, is also another dimension of collaboration that moves beyond the purely intellectual into the spiritual and pastoral.
That's exciting. That's wonderful to hear. One of the things I have highlighted, I've got all sorts of notes here on your article that I'm going to occasionally refer to, but under your discussion of the theological, you had this quote: "We owe to the Second Vatican Council and to the liturgical movement that preceded it the rediscovery of a theological understanding of the liturgy and its importance in the life of the church." So a rediscovery says that something was lost, right? Do you want to speak to that a little?
Of course. So that's a quote from Pope Francis's apostolic letter, Desiderio Desideravi, which he published in June of 2022 on the Feast of Saints Peter and Paul. And one thing to note about this quote is I don't think the Pope is saying that the magisterium or that scholarship has lost the theological dimension. He relies upon his predecessors, his papal predecessors, as well as the Second Vatican Council, to articulate his own view of the theology of liturgy. So clearly he thinks it's still present there. And he recognizes the tremendous contributions of academic scholarship to a theology of liturgy. But what I think the Pope is challenging us to, especially as academic theologians, is to make our work more widely available to the Christian faithful, to find ways to take sometimes high philosophical or academic language, to take our jargon, as it were, and to translate that and to be able to communicate it to people who don't have or aren't seeking advanced degrees in theology. And so this has been a challenge.
To the sheep, I always say, get it to the sheep.
Get it to the sheep. So I practice this regularly in going out to give parish talks or diocesan talks. And it is a challenge. It's not a straightforward, just give a classroom lecture. It
Right.
requires a lot of work.
Yeah. Well, as a teacher of homiletics, I mean, that's one of the things I'm always trying to, help seminarians with is the language. You can't always use the same language, the high, dense language of the seminary when you're giving a homily to a sheep. You've got to, help. Sometimes I'll turn to, one of my grandchildren in the pew and I'll, whisper, "Do you know what a covenant is?" And they'll say, "No." And I say, "Well, do you know what a promise is?" "Oh, that we know," So just sort of helping with the language. And obviously, the language of the liturgy and theological aspects of it can be extremely complicated. So that sense that it has been, to a large part, lost for the laity, and helping people rediscover it is an important aspect that sort of goes back over to the other aspect you mentioned, which is the pastoral aspect of it. Yeah. How do we do that?
How do we do that?
Yeah, tell me how we do that.
The first step is to make sure our seminarians, our future priests, are aware of these differences, that what we're doing in the academic classroom is important work and is important for their own understanding and their own engagement and participation in the liturgy, but to recognize, to help them see where our jargon might be different than what they might use in the parish.
So how do we do that? How do we
connect this theological, even historical, juridical study of liturgy to the pastoral, as well as the spiritual, to help people connect in their own lives? The first step is to help seminarians understand the difference between the classroom study of the liturgy and its use of dense language and jargon, and how it can be presented in the parish. And one of the biggest challenges is when we study liturgy, we presume a great deal of theology. We presume an understanding of who Christ is. We presume a basic understanding of the Trinity, of ecclesiology, the theology of the church. And oftentimes what we'll find in magisterial documents is that they too assume all of that knowledge, and they just begin to move forward without really reviewing that. So one thing that can be helpful, I have found in the pastoral setting, is to take some time to review the person and life of Christ. What is the Paschal mystery? What is a mystery in the Christian sense? Before moving on then to talk about how the liturgy is a celebration of the Paschal mystery. So doing some of that remedial work in theology at a basic level can help with the pastoral situation.
One of the things that you mentioned was, and I really wanted to understand this better, was that contemporary man's has sort of lost the capacity for what you call symbols. And I was trying to think, well, I wish you had put in an example exactly. But I thought about the whole thing we were brought up with, a sacrament as an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. Was that the type of thing you're talking about when you say this, we've lost the concept of symbol, or is it something else?
Yes, it's related. So this, again, it's a quote from Francis and Desiderio Desideravi, and he's really relying heavily on the theologian Romano Guardini, a German theologian who was writing around the 1920s into the 1950s and 60s. So prior to the Second Vatican Council. And Guardini sees a loss of symbol, our capacity to engage in symbol, really as rooted in a loss of many people to see supernatural realities, transcendent realities, spiritual realities being revealed and even manifested in creation, in created realities, in bread and wine. That the beauty of creation reveals God's act as creator. I think Francis follows a similar direction, but in a little bit different way. So Francis will say, for example, agreeing with Guardini that we no longer see the human person as a symbol of body and soul. Francis will say we know that because of how we treat the human person, that we're not treating the human person as if they have a soul that deserves respect and dignity. And so I think Francis wants to challenge us. If we really had a capacity for symbol, it would be reflected in how we treat creation as coming from a creator, and how we treat human persons as having a supernatural soul, in similar sorts of projects.
So, I mean, especially the Western culture, certainly, especially the American culture, is a very harsh culture at this point in time. Between feminism and in its bad sense, and of course now we have the woke culture, but we don't have a culture that appreciates beauty and mystery. And obviously the abortion, the culture of death in which, we're trying to promote the church and you're trying to promote liturgy is all taking place in this culture of death. So you are trying to reach people with concepts I can see that are very difficult for them.
And at one point, I believe it's in Fratelli Tutti, Francis makes the comment that you may claim to respect human dignity. You may claim that you recognize that the body is a symbol of the soul. And yet, the way that we're treating migrants, for example, is showing that we don't really believe that. And so these sorts of situations make formation in liturgy, which is dependent upon a symbolic view of the world, it makes doing that formation incredibly difficult.
So where would you say that formation has to start? Like, what is the route that you would recommend starting with?
Following Francis, I would say that it starts in the home. It starts with the family, what's often called the domestic church. In Desiderio Desideravi, Francis gives a beautiful example of a parent or grandparent assisting a small child in making the sign of the cross for the first time, and taking their hand and showing them how to do it, and then explaining that to them. So that's, in a sense, where the liturgical formation begins, but that's also the home. The family is also where that respect for the other begins. Respect for other persons in the family, engaging as a family in social activities of assisting those in need who are hungry, who are thirsty, who are homeless. So much of that, I think, starts in the family.
Absolutely. Yeah. It reminds me, I had a situation with my son about a year ago. He came to me and he was talking about, how the children have to eat their dinner. And there had been quite a scene with one of his younger children, who was about 5, I guess, at the time, of being made to eat his dinner. And, but this particular child is a very, very sensitive child, a very unusual, delicate little child. And I said to him, you can't be that rough and tough on that child. And he said, "What do you mean, Mom? You were like that with me." And I said, "Well, yeah, because you're kind of a normal kid." and most of your, he has 5 children. I said, "Your other 4 children, you can be that tough with about eating their dinner. But not with that one, because he's different. And you have to recognize his gentle, tender little soul is very different than your other children. I hate to say he's not normal. And so you have to be aware of his uniqueness. And you have to pay attention to that when you're parenting." And my son was surprised by that, but he realized I was correct. That you can't, that there just wasn't a template that you could just stamp everybody with, that you have to be aware of the individual person. So it was kind of a sweet moment. And he actually went home and apologized to the little guy and kind of realized things had to go differently with this one. And so it was sweet. But yeah, it does begin in the home, the respect. I said, you have to respect his person, and his person is very different. You have to see that. And he's a good parent. But so yeah, it does begin in the home.
And when we do liturgical formation, oftentimes we're looking to the symbols of liturgy to try to explain them. So we might look, for example, at the experience of baptismal water. And we want to draw there when we're doing a formation on the baptismal water. We would want to draw on both the life-giving qualities of water, but also the death-dealing qualities of water. That water is something we need to live, and we can't live very long without it. But water can also cause floods and devastation and destruction. And one of the things that struck me as you were reflecting is the more we can personalize those experiences, the more we can connect individual persons to how they have experienced the life-giving quality of water and the way they have experienced the destructive or even death-dealing qualities of water, the more impactful that formation will be. As theologians, we can speak of these things generally. We can say that floods happen. But if you have a community that just experienced a flood, that takes on a whole new sort of power in formation to be able to really work through the depth of these symbols that we experience in the liturgy.
Great. I certainly discussed that when I taught homiletics, the importance of knowing the sheep personally. Even the difference we've talked about between the homily for the Saturday night crew and the Sunday morning crew, very different groups of people. And then obviously, if like you say, if a tragedy has taken place, all of the liturgy takes on a different and newer meaning when people are in sorrow. So you have to be aware of that. You can't just ignore it, it's fascinating. Yeah. You talk about the need for ongoing formation even after seminary. Talk about that a little bit. I thought that was important.
Yeah, so we in the seminary, following both the Vatican and the U.S. bishops, encourage the men that after ordination, they seek out opportunities as priests to continue their formation in many different areas. So here, of course, I would be focused largely in the area of liturgy, both theologically, but also spiritually and pastorally. So one big area that is a challenge to cover in the seminary, simply because of the constraints of time, is the ars celebrandi, the art of celebrating. So in seminary, we can cover the theology of the rites and their history. We can look at the current documents, the liturgical books and various other norms that govern the celebration of liturgy, so that the men can celebrate the rites correctly with the mind and the heart of the church. But oftentimes we really struggle to find the time to go in depth on the art of celebrating, the ars celebrandi, that there is more required than the correct enactment of the rites, as important as that correct enactment is, right? That's the foundation on which the art of celebrating is built. But we would want to encourage them, for example, to pursue more options, to think about how is their vocal delivery of texts? How might they improve their own singing, for example, if they're chanting in the liturgy? Each parish church presents a different physical context in which the liturgy is celebrated. So the movements, processions, relationships to other ministers all change depending on where you are and with whom you're celebrating. And so challenging them to work on those sorts of deep avenues of ars celebrandi would be one area of ongoing formation. Of course, we also want them to always pursue a deeper theological understanding of the rites as well, and stay up to date when things change. So in liturgy, things don't change often, but we are expecting, we just received a new translation of the Order of Penance. We are expecting new translations of the Holy Communion and worship of the Eucharistic mystery outside of Mass, the book for bringing communion, or doing communion services, if you will, bringing communion to the sick, adoration, exposition, that sort of thing. And we're also anticipating a revised translation of what will now be called the Order of Christian Initiation of Adults, formerly the RCIA. And then there's other books further down the road as well. So staying up to date with those sorts of rites. Oftentimes the new translation gives another opportunity to revisit what they may have had 5 or 10 or even 50 years ago.
Well, I certainly discuss a lot of those things in my own book, Home for the Homily. First of all, that everything is being watched by the laity. Everything that happens in the liturgy is being watched. Your attitudes, not just what you say, but how you say it. You've mentioned tone, body language. All of those things are important, to the liturgy. And the idea that things have to come from the heart. You can get up and say something, but someone knows, if I say to you, I love you, or I love you, it makes a difference. Is it you just saying words, or does it come from the heart? When I start with teaching the lecturing practicum that preceded homiletics, someone would get up and read, and I would say, I don't believe a word of what you just said, I don't believe you believe it. Could you try reading that again so that we might believe that you actually believe what you're reading, and trying to eventually make someone realize that you need that theological understanding yourself to give that theological understanding. Otherwise, it's just words. Our priest right now that we've had at our local parish for about the last 5 or 6 years, as soon as he got there and during the Mass, when he takes the chalice, and he's done it at every single Mass, he takes the chalice and he'll say, and he took the chalice, and he just does this thing where he almost caresses the chalice with his hands, and his words, the tone of his words, you just immediately see Jesus and this love of the chalice, and it's beautiful. And it just touches my heart every time he does it. And in seeing him do it like that, it opened up something in the Mass to me that had never been revealed before. He did that. And so those, sometimes it's little tiny things, like you're saying, tone of voice, a gesture, that truly comes from the person's heart, that the soul comes through the body, that allows the laity, it allows us sheep to enter into the liturgy in a deeper manner. And that's so important. Yeah, so important.
And something else the Pope challenges us to, as members of the Assembly, is to really look into and foster our own Ars Celebrandi. How are we engaging in the rites? Do we stand kind of lackadaisically, or do we stand with intention and with purpose? Do we simply make the sign of the cross because it's something we have to do, and we do it as quickly and as we can to get it over with, or do we really very intentionally cross ourselves? And of course, the examples could be multiplied, but that's something unique, I think, to Pope Francis's Desiderio Desideravi, is just in the undercurrents of scholarship, there has been a seeming move to really look at the Ars Celebrandi of the Assembly, but now Pope Francis has put it into an apostolic letter. And he doesn't give any concrete answers of do this or do that, but rather he challenges everyone involved to really look at their role within the church and their role within their own parish, and to ask, what does my Ars Celebrandi look like, and how do I enact that in communion with others who are celebrating?
Well, it's very common, of course. I have 4 children and 13 grandchildren. It's very common to hear children say, "This is boring." It's boring. And so to slowly start to teach them and to just outright tell them, well, maybe it's boring because you don't participate. It's just boring. Of course, you're just sort of there as an uncaring sort of listener, but so starting to say, well, the more you participate, the more you do the responses and do the sign of the cross with intention, the less boring it will be. But the sort of the other side of that is with adults who say, well, I didn't get anything out of the Mass. It's like, well, what did you put into the Mass? First of all, you're not there to necessarily get something out of it. You're there to give right praise, to begin with. So are you doing that? But, also, how much did you participate? And very often the people who say, I didn't get anything out of the Mass. Well, if you kind of glance at them during the Mass, they're not participating in the Mass. So we do have our part to play. That there's a response back and forth. That's important. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's kind of fun. So, when we have the grandkids, you have to nudge them. You have to keep them participating. But again, that's the role of parents and grandparents for our young people, is to help them learn how to participate in the Mass. It's not necessarily something that comes naturally. It is an art. It has to be learned. It has to be taught. It has to be learned. You have to work at it. Yeah.
And helping everyone, children and adults too, to learn how to pray outside of Mass can help with kind of participation in. So reading the scriptures so that when you hear them on Sunday, it's not the first encounter, but is in fact an encounter with Christ. When the scriptures are proclaimed in the church, it is Christ himself who speaks. And so are we reading the scriptures before we go to Mass on Sunday, especially? Doing it for weekdays can be a bit hard for those who go to weekday Mass, but especially in preparing for Sunday, do you have silent moments in your prayer life or in your life at all? So that so that the silence during liturgy, you know how to enter into that. It's not this foreign thing, but it's something familiar yet of a different level of efficaciousness. Do you engage with holy water or candles in your regular prayer life so that when you walk into the church and sign yourself with the holy water font or look upon the candles around the altar, that those are more meaningful outside of the liturgy too, that this is a sign of prayer, that this is a sign of baptismal reminder of renewing the covenant, of self-sacrifice, all these images associated with candles and water. So if that's kind of lacking outside of the liturgy, then certainly it will be very challenging to engage in truly full and active, that type of participation that is fully active, in the sense that you participate in silence in a different way than you participate in singing.
Right.
And you have to learn how to do those.
Right. One of the two things that we've done, one is that once we had children, we made a point of sitting in the front row so they could see what was going on. A lot of times people don't realize when they bring children to Mass, if they sit in the back, all the child can see is the back of the person standing.
And that's certainly boring. Yeah.
Yeah, that's boring. So get the children up front. One of the things we've done outside of Mass, it's been fun with quite a number of, our children, but now with the grandchildren, is as soon as they're old enough to read, well, even before that, but as soon as they're old enough to read, we do compline with them at night when they spend the night here. And as soon as they're able to read, competently at all, like by the time they're 5 or 6, we let them be the officiant.
Sure.
And so they think that's pretty cool. For a while we're the officiant when they can't read, but then it's like, okay, you can be the officiant now. And so they start to realize how exciting it is to be the officiant. And we are the people responding. But also they want that response from the people. And so they get to sort of be on the other side of the track, I think that experience I've seen that as a good experience for children, to bring them into the idea of liturgy outside of the Mass.
Yeah. And for individuals, for persons who might be a little intimidated by jumping right into compline, although it's of the more simple offices, but even taking a part of night prayer. Protect us, Lord, as we stay awake, and watch over us as we sleep, that awake we may keep watch with Christ, and asleep rest in his peace. Just saying that is the nightly prayer, to kind of get in that habit, because sometimes it's hard to form a habit if it's too much. And so just beginning piece by piece, and then if you can work your way to the full night prayer, that's wonderful too. But you got to start somewhere, and we need to. Part of the challenge of seminary formation in liturgy, but also wider formation in liturgy, is really trying to understand where people are and how to get them from where they are to where the church is hoping that we all come to be.
Right. In homiletics, I talk about baby steps and how important. I said never say to your congregation, go home and say the rosary. I say, if you go home and say one Hail Mary while you're changing the diaper, or, taking a shower, or washing the dishes, or sweeping the floor, or changing the oil in the car, or you're at a stoplight, say one Hail Mary. I say, if you can get people to say one Hail Mary, you can change the world. But if you say go home, you're right. You say go home and do the rosary. It's so overwhelming. Like what, how, where, I'm a convert to Catholicism, so I know that, to be told to go home and say the rosary daily or weekly is an overwhelming challenge. But I can start with one Hail Mary, and then 2, and then 3, and then you can build on that. So those baby steps.
Mm-hmm.
In your article, you talk about, let's see if I can find it here, that there's parts of the liturgy that are changeable, and then there's, of course, parts that are not changeable. They're not changeable theologically or historically. But then there's things that are not only changeable, but ought to be changed. And of course, that's a big issue right now in the church. There was huge changes made with Vatican II. And some of those changes have not been welcomed by some and by others. And then some changes were well meant, but haven't been well carried out. So maybe I'll let you speak to some of those issues.
So the comment about there are elements of the liturgy subject to change and those which are not subject to change, which are immutable, that was in the historical section, and it comes from Sacrosanctum Concilium, the Constitution on Sacred Liturgy, promulgated by the Fathers of Vatican II. And one thing I always remind my students is this Constitution was not promulgated by Paul VI by himself. It was promulgated with 2,268 signatures on the document. It's a document of the Ecumenical Council, which gives it very high standing. But in any case, so the Ecumenical Council, Vatican II, is telling us that there are elements subject to change, which ought to be changed, says the document, if they've kind of fallen out of line with the nature of liturgy. And there are elements not subject to change. So the first question we have to ask is, which elements are which? And that's what the historical study of liturgy does for us. So remember, I tend to look at liturgy, at the study of liturgy, as theological, historical, juridical, spiritual, and pastoral. So this is the historical component. This is one of its big tasks, is to say, this element is changeable, this one is not changeable. And so a lot of the reforms that were coming from the council, that came after the council, were motivated by these historical studies, which were very well documented from really the mid-1800s onward up into the council and of course even to today. So that's where many of the reforms made decisions about what was changeable and what was not changeable. A couple key elements here to think about is moving somewhat into the juridical. So we have to remember we move in and out of these aspects. And that is that the rites as reformed after Vatican II are all promulgated by the Holy Father. Every single rite that we have, that we use legitimately, is promulgated, most of them in a first instance by Paul VI, and then perhaps edited by John Paul II, and then repromulgated, or in some cases, the first time by John Paul II. And then as we get later rites, it would be other popes, but many of them were promulgated by either Paul VI or John Paul II. And so questions of authority loom large here, that academics may debate about the effectiveness of the reform. People in the parishes might debate about the effect of the reform. But one thing we always need to keep in mind is these are all promulgated by the Pope. And so we need to recognize that in our discussions. And I'm not saying we can't be legitimately critical in an academic sense of critical, meaning that we look at the rites and we analyze them and we say, maybe this seems a little strange in our context. Kind of an example I draw from one of my mentors is the rites of ordination. The rites of ordination are heavily geared towards diocesan priests. Are they sufficient for monastic priests or religious order priests? That's a question we can ask, and yet we always ask it with respect and obedience to the authority of the church. Another dimension of this is that there are options within the rites as promulgated by the popes. And so we need to be very clear about who has authority over these various options. Sometimes the options are left to the Episcopal Conference, so the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Those choices can't be made by a priest in a parish. It's for the conference. Sometimes there's about a dozen or so that are in the missal, in particular, that are left to the diocesan bishop or the local ordinary. Again, that's for the local ordinary, not for others.
Right.
Some of them are left to the presider. And so the presider can legitimately make choices. And as you can kind of tell, this gets very complicated, right? And so we need to do good formation on showing where people have options and how you make them. But the point I would end this on is that all of those options are to be made for the spiritual and pastoral good of the faithful, the spiritual and pastoral good of the concrete worshiping assembly. They're not about individual preferences or academic ideologies. They are about the salvation of souls. They're about the good of the faithful. So we always need to keep that in view.
So, we're certainly in a time where the reforms have not been accepted by large groups of people in the church. Would you answer to that problem that we're dealing with right now? Certainly people that want to go back to, pre-Vatican II. And I mean, as we know, like Pope John Paul II finally said, okay, these people, for instance, the Tridentine Mass, they were brought up with that liturgy. They love it. They have a right to have access to it. And then it was brought back. And it seemed to be going well for a while. But then that same group said, okay, we like this so much, we're going to say that the new reforms are not valid. And we want only that. And so now Francis has kind of put a halt to the whole thing, which is I think is very understandable, given that it's kind of gone down the chute. But I'd like you to speak to that problem, because it is problematic right now.
So my first reaction would to be that we need to be careful with how we identify in groups. So I would be intrigued to see statistics on size. So you mentioned a large group of the faithful.
Well, I should say a loud group. Why don't I stick with loud instead of large?
Because
it's a very vocal group, certainly
Yeah.
on social media, and other forms of the media, probably small but loud.
So I would want to be attentive to that type of distinction, and that's an important distinction to make, and to make sure that we're speaking accurately on those the differences between groups and things of this nature. The second reaction I would have is that the approach to this always needs to be very pastoral, with the aim that Pope Francis has articulated, that his hope for the church is that we can all celebrate according to the rite as reformed after the council. And so, again, as a seminary professor and as someone who works in and for dioceses, I would want to affirm what the Pope is saying and to find ways to follow the Pope's vision, just as I would want to find ways to follow Paul VI's vision in promulgating the Missal, or John Paul II's vision in re-editing and repromulgating that same Missal. So my ultimate aim would be to respect the authority of the Holy See and of the Holy Father. And if Francis is leading us in a direction, then we need to find ways that are pastorally sensitive, but also respectful of his legitimate authority as the successor of Peter.
And as you say, that's an art to be learned, right? Hopefully, in this formation time in the seminary. Yeah, it's a lot to be learned by young men that are headed out as sheep among wolves. Sometimes it can be very difficult.
And it is challenging, especially in the liturgical sphere, where the old saying is, where 3 or 4 liturgists are gathered, there are 5 or 6 opinions. It can be challenging for these young men, especially when they go almost immediately into the position as a pastor, which is becoming increasingly more common in certain dioceses, not everywhere, but in some places, to recognize, to be able to see where the people are. What in the liturgy do they really find fruitful and efficacious in their own Christian life within that particular community? And where do they struggle? Where do they find challenges? The difficulty for young men and for new pastors is to be able to really discern that within a parish and recognizing that they too are part of the parish. So it's not as if the pastor stands apart from the parish, but he's also within the parish, and understanding how he fits within that, especially in the liturgical life, can be a big challenge. Where 2 or 3 are gathered, there are 4 or 5 opinions.
Yeah, we really see the importance of praying for our pastors, especially young men, coming from the seminary and being put in these leadership positions. And you're right, we don't want it to become clericalism, us versus them, but a sense of we're all in this together. I certainly bring that concept out in Home for the Homily, that the homily has to have that sense of we're all in this together. There's a famous quote of a bishop in Europe saying, "We're all equal, all the way from me, all the way down to you." So we want to get away from that concept, that we are all in the boat with Jesus together. But the need to pray for our priests, pray for our pastors. It's so easy when a pastor does something wrong or something we don't like or that we perceive as wrong or is wrong, to just immediately complain and gripe. I have a prayer group that meets at my house once a week for years now. And we kind of learned at one point, if you didn't like something, it was very easy to have a gripe session about your priest. And then to realize, okay, all right, we all have problems. We all have issues. So now we limit our griping to a few minutes and then we do prayer in hopes of, and also to look sort of for more creative solutions and more pastoral from our point, from the lay position, that we have to be pastoral as well. We have to be pastoral to our pastors, and pray for them, and take concerns to them to discuss charitably, if we don't like something that's being done or something that's being changed, to sort of find out why it's being changed and, what is the heart of the priest as to why. So the faithful have to be pastoral also. Sometimes we're not, sometimes the sheep get ugly. And we think that, well, he's the priest, he has to be pastoral, but we can be little monsters. So, I think there is a training of the sheep to be kinder and more charitable as well.
And this can be challenging within the area of liturgy, because again, there are lots of opinions about style. So it's not just the pastor. Oftentimes music is a big point of discussion, shall we say. Art, especially if a church is going through renovation or construction, the spatial arts like visual paintings or statuary, the general architecture. Of course, people have strong feelings about all of these. But to be able to, on the idea of formation, to be able to educate ourselves to learn, what is my style? Where does it come from? What are its merits? What are its limitations? No particular style can say it all. Some say it better than others, but none says it all. And so understanding what the value of our liturgical artistic styles are, what their limitations are. And that's a challenge also in seminary. We do our best to incorporate, for example, some study of the history of art, including the history of sacred art, and more specifically, the history of liturgical art, looking at how chant developed, how the use of the organ developed, how architectural styles changed over time. All of these things, are historical realities that a knowledge of that history can help us see, oh, okay, I really like the Gothic, but there's also the Romanesque and the Baroque, and these have their own values to add to our church's rich heritage. And so it's a struggle in seminary because, again, limited time. As an academic who's trying to form these men in certain topics, I would love to have them for 14, 15 years.
Right.
But that's not realistic. So we do our best, but that's another area for continuing formation, that perhaps priests in particular can be learning about the arts, especially if they didn't have that opportunity in seminary, but also that the lay faithful might take a dive into the history of sacred art or the history of liturgical art. That might help at least temper some of these discussions to make them fraternal and to make them more charitable.
You just have to have formation that continues after seminary because, like you said, it's such a short period of time. When I was working with young seminarians, I had them for 2 semesters, which, means you have about, at the most, maybe you can do 30 homilies, per student, and that's a lot. but you just need to continue that formation, because like you're saying, would love to have like so many more years with them. There's so much to be learned. And it's exciting, and to stop learning is always a shame. It's a terrible thing. The human mind wants to learn, is open to learning. I've been very blessed to be doing the Catholic Bookworm, which keeps me reading all sorts of things that I wouldn't have been reading. I'd be lazy otherwise. So, but the time factor can be tough, both in seminary and after seminary, to just make the time to continue education. Lifelong learning is important. I think a lot of times pastors do get, unfortunately, they get so busy sometimes with, just the business aspect of running a parish, the numbers, funding, and all of those kinds of things. I'd love to see that taken away from pastors, have an administrator and the pastor's not doing that stuff, that he's really just able to do his own lifelong learning and then pour it into the liturgy and the homily and pastoral care.
In liturgy, when pastors can work collaboratively with lay people, for example, do we have enough bread? Do we have enough wine? Do we have a good stock of candles? All of those could be handled by a good sacristan, for example. And so really fostering those relationships with sacristans, lay liturgical leaders, who can take care of some of that day to day, because you can't celebrate Eucharist without the bread. Right. So you got to make sure you have it. But removing that, letting others kind of take the charge of that, so that the pastor can maybe spend more time preparing his homily instead of going online to order the next group of supplies. That the pastor might go online and, reread some of his liturgical formation from seminary, or reread a document of the council, can be very valuable. And they seem a little mundane, but I do know some pastors who order all that themselves, and I'm thinking, let somebody else do that. You work on your homily.
Right, exactly. I think learning to delegate is an art itself, and it's probably not taught in. We don't have the delegate course. Learning to delegate should be a course all by itself. But you're absolutely right. To have that time to work on the homily, or visiting the sick, or meeting with a family in need, rather than ordering the candles and the bread, or sitting and checking the finances is, we really need that learning to delegate. Which is, and again, that's part of the faithful stepping up, the sheep stepping up to the plate, trying to get people, participate in your parish, participate on grounds, and keeping the church in line. I do the flowers at my church, which is a lot of work. And, but it means one less thing that the pastor has to try to figure out what to do. Yeah. So that's kind of important. One last thing I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned enculturation, which is a favorite topic of mine. That, the liturgy obviously has changed across the parts that can change across cultures and peoples and traditions, which I always find fascinating. One of the stories that I love, I've spent some time in Haiti. And I've done some work there, and I've made a few trips, and sort of the short story in Haiti, from what I understand, is that when the Protestants first went to Haiti, they basically said to the people, you have to get rid of all your religion and adopt Christianity. You have to get rid of your voodoo and your worship of the dead, and get rid of everything, and, and start over. And they said, no, go away. And then the Catholics came in and said, well, we can work with some of your beliefs. And, the worship of the dead, well, we don't quite believe that, but we do believe in communion of saints and praying for the dead, and that they can pray for us. And so we can kind of work with your ideas. And the Haitian people said, oh, we like that. Okay, we'll work with you Catholics. And so now when you go to Haiti, it's just amazing. You see Mary everywhere. Paintings of Mary, depictions of Mary, shrines, Catholic shrines. It's just lovely. And then the Protestants kind of went, oh, maybe we'll go back in with a different mindset. So I'm fascinated by enculturation. And I know historically it's had issues with it in the church. And but why don't I let you speak to that a little bit?
So enculturation has, of course, two dimensions. It's the bringing of the gospel into a culture. And of course, even that itself presumes a certain amount of culture, right? The gospel was written in a certain context. It was written in a certain language, in Greek. And even especially later in history, maybe if you think of the mission activity of the second millennium, the bringing of the gospel presumes a certain type of European culture. So even the bringing of the gospel into a new culture already presumes culture. But that one dimension of bringing the gospel into a culture, but also that the second dimension would be that the church accepts from cultures that which is not contrary to the gospel. And of course, there are things that are contrary to the gospel, as you mentioned, but to recognize the genius and talents and values of various cultures to bring it in. So we always have to, when we talk about enculturation, sometimes there's a tendency to focus on one or the other of these dimensions, and we need to really strive to keep them in balance. The second comment I would have on enculturation is we do need to make sure we're grounding it theologically. To ground it, for example, in the reality that God calls a people to salvation, that we are always called, yes, as individuals, as persons, but we're always called to salvation as persons in communion. And that goes way back in salvation history. Incarnation, the incarnation of Christ, that the Son of God is made flesh in a culture, that also provides some theological grounding from the perspective of Christology. So we have a kind of a soteriological, a salvation grounding, salvation history grounding, but also a Christological grounding. And we could continue those. So we need to focus on making sure, especially individuals who struggle with the idea of enculturation, which I find in the seminary is present, that they understand there are theological foundations to this that need to be explained. And then in terms of liturgy in particular, to really take a look at history in an honest way to see how the celebration of the Eucharist has taken on these different forms, has adapted elements of a certain culture to itself. Imperial court ceremonies, for example, the use of the way that bishops vested, or the way in which they processed, and the entourage that they put around themselves. How does that connect with imperial court ceremonial and these sorts of ideas? Just to give a basis to say, this is not new, right? This is part of the liturgical tradition, but it always requires care. We can also look at history for bad examples of things that maybe shouldn't have happened. And so we can learn from those examples to help us draw the lines of this is appropriate, this is of great value to bring into our liturgical heritage, and maybe this is not such a good idea. And so the theological and the historical study of liturgy can be of great value to enculturation. But of course, the work of it today, for my third point, is that it is a pastoral work, that it always has to be done with pastoral care, always with attention not to high abstract ideals, but to the concrete spiritual needs of the faithful. And until you can assess those needs, until you can meet people and see what their needs are, to encounter them one-on-one or in small groups, this work of enculturation can't move forward. So it's certainly a pastoral work geared at the spiritual life of the faithful.
One of the sweet things that was done at Holy Apostles, it was a small thing, but it was lovely and pastoral, I believe, was the rosary that was said, I think each day in the afternoon. We had a very international campus, so we had quite a number of Vietnamese, but we also had people from Africa, Poland, France, South Central America. And whoever was leading the rosary would do the first refrain of the Hail Mary in their own language. And it was absolutely beautiful. It was sweet. And so you got to hear people, speak in their own language with their own accent. And it was just absolutely lovely and very, very pastoral. And it was just beautiful. It was a beautiful thing. And you didn't need to know the language because you knew what was being said, that it was the Hail Mary. So it was very simple. But you could see people loved the ability to hear the Hail Mary in their mother tongue. It was beautiful. Yeah.
That's wonderful.
And such a simple thing, a pastoral thing, but it's a very simple pastoral thing. I don't know who began it there, but I always thought it was brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Is there anything, we've kind of gone all over the place, and your article is wonderful. It's well written, and I learned things from it that I didn't know, which was exciting. Is there anything that we haven't mentioned that you would like to mention before we finish?
No, I think my final comment would simply be, the article is written in light of, it was published this past spring, 2023. It was written in light of Pope Francis's Desiderio Desideravi and the new program of priestly formation. And so my last comment would be, Desiderio Desideravi is a very rich document. It's really, in my view, a reinvigoration of the vision of Vatican II for today, because things have changed in the past 60 years. We have 60 years now, roughly, a little less, of experience with the rites as reformed after the council. And so it is time to be reflecting once more on these basic principles, on these basic theological ideas. And so I would simply invite everyone to pray with the document. Don't just read it, but to really pray with it and see in it, there's a call to each person in it of how they can deepen their own liturgical formation. And there's a call also for dialogue, for the laity and the ordained ministers, for laity of different groups, for families within the family, but also with others, to be in dialogue with one another, to see how we can really enrich our liturgical formation for today and our liturgical participation.
Well, the prayer group that I have here, we do scripture and tradition, and so I will certainly bring it up as our next document to read here. And
that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, and get this interview out onto our social media so different people will hear about it, which is exciting, which is the hope for all of this. Yeah.
And the great thing about Vatican documents, they're all free online.
They're all free. They're online. That's wonderful. Absolutely.
Pope Francis, liturgical formation of the people of God. Just look that up and you're good to go.
Liturgical formation of the people of God. Great. Thank you. How about you end us with a prayer?
Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Thank you so much. Really appreciated the interview, and I'll be speaking with your colleagues as well that are in the journal. So it's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiki.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.